Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With 6 weeks left for the elections, we examine the state of the economy with particular reference to 5 aspects: growth, unemployment, inflation, investment, and of course the state of the rupee. And joining me for this critical discussion is the former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Rakesh Mohan. Dr. Mohan, let's start with growth. With quarter one coming in at 13.5%, which is 2.7% below the RBI's forecast of 16.2%, and with it widely expected that in the second half of the financial year, the economy will grow by 4.6%, would you accept that it's virtually impossible for the economy to achieve the budget target of 7.2%?
Well, as you know, most agencies have reduced the expected growth rate from the original 7.2% of the government. The RBI has brought it down to 7 in their last statement, and other agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, have all reduced the growth rate that is expected. UNCTAD, of course, has reduced it even further to a much lower thing. Now, the likelihood of 7 is dependent on the second quarter, which will come out in a few days, being between 6.1 to 6.3. So if that happens and there's a little greater confidence in achieving 7 for the whole year.
But if it doesn't happen?
If it doesn't happen, my guess is I'm reasonably confident it'll be between 6.5 and 7. Quite frankly, one thing I should say and preface all my remarks actually is that the world, and of course therefore India, is beset by greater economic uncertainty than it has seen for God knows how long, like 40, 50 years. Whether it's inflation, whether it's the
Commodity situation?
synchronized tightening of the monetary policies across particularly the developed countries, the Ukraine war, and associated impacts through commodity prices, etc. And we just don't know how this is going to pan out.
So then let me ask you this, given the unprecedented uncertainty that faces us, with how much conviction are you saying that you expect the economy will come in between 6.5 and 7?
As I said, I think that if the Q2 comes in at around 6.1, 6, 6.3, something of that order, I think 6.5 to 7 is achievable.
And at which end? At the 7 end or the 6.5?
Well, somewhere, because of this uncertainty, I think it is not correct almost for projections or expectations to be made with greater uncertainty. I think therefore it is correct for me to say, look, I don't know, but I guess it will.
Can I paraphrase that? What you're saying is that if quarter 2 comes in at 6.1 to 6.3, your expectation is that the economy at the end of the year will be somewhere between 6.5 and 7, but given the unprecedented uncertainty, the likes of which we haven't seen for 4 or 5 decades, it's hard to speak with conviction.
Hard to speak with precision.
With precision. Let me put to you what UNCTAD has said. UNCTAD says that in fact the economy will grow at just 5.7%. That's way lower than the RBI. It's lower than the World Bank. It's even lower than what our own chief economic advisor has said. He echoes your view. It'll be somewhere between 6.5 and 7. But UNCTAD says just 5.7.
Yeah, I don't quite understand why they have given that kind of very low number, because it really means a huge slowing down in the second half.
And clearly they are anticipating that quarter two, when it comes out in the next 4 or 5 days, will be lower than 6.1.
Exactly. Yeah.
If quarter two is lower than 6.1, will that then give greater credibility to the UNCTAD figure of 5.7?
You have to ask me next week.
You're hedging your bets very cleverly.
Well, as I said, given this uncertainty, I think it's intelligent for almost all economists to say that, look, there is this uncertainty.
But this is very interesting. Ask you next week means that you're not denying that UNCTAD could turn out to be correct if quarter two comes below 6.1.
No, I think it's unlikely.
But it's still possible.
It's unlikely. It's always possible.
It's always. This is the uncertainty. Even unlikely is possible because of the uncertainty.
To give you a personal example, 50 years ago, when the US visa counselor here in the embassy, when I was going back to the US for my PhD, can you assure me that you'll come back to India? So I said, look, I intend to come back, but I can't tell the future, can you?
Okay, I will then put it like this.
No, so seriously.
I put it like this, and I think I'll be fair to you.
Yeah.
It's likely that 6.1 to 6.3 will be met when quarter two results are announced in the next 4 or 5 days. But if the economy falls below 6.1, then the possibility of UNCTAD being right with a 5.7 figure does emerge. I'm saying the possibility does emerge.
Well, even then it's unlikely that to the extent that we expect it to be 6.5 to 7, given around 6, 6.1, 6.3, whatever for Q2.
Okay, it will fall below 6.5, but not all the way to 5.7.
That is highly unlikely.
So it could fall below 6.5, but not all the way to 5.8. If quarter two fails us. Let's look down the road. Because as you said, the international global situation clearly is not going to help India. Interest rates are high in Western countries and they're unlikely to come down in a hurry. Because of the geopolitical tensions in the world, commodity prices, including oil, are elevated. They're not going to come down in a hurry. The opportunity for India to increase exports to Europe and America is probably at this moment of time non-existent, because many European countries are slipping into recession and India's own exports have been declining in October. And then finally, because the high dollar, money is actually going back to America. So when you look down the road to 23-24, could UNCTAD be right? Because they're predicting 4.7. And this time, I noticed that UNCTAD is supported by Moody's, who yesterday came out with a figure of 4.8. So there are now two agencies saying that in 23-24, India will fall further to 4.7 or 4.8. Could that be right?
I doubt it. Obviously, if all those things, if all those negatives in fact do fructify, it'll be lower than 6.5, 7 or so. But I would be...
This is next year we're talking about, not this year.
Yeah, I'm talking about next year. I would be very, very surprised.
So what's your figure for next year?
Well, I haven't done specific projections.
But your hunch?
So I haven't done specific projections. But let me, before I come to any number, if I do, there are some positive signs in the Indian economy, despite
which are
all the negatives. One, the corporates are deleveraged relative to, say, 5 years ago.
So company balance sheets are in better shape.
Are much healthier. Okay, so the debt equity ratio now is around 40% on average, which is pretty good. The bank balance sheets have been cleaned up to a great extent. The capital adequacy
ratios... Can I just interrupt here and point out that in fact the Indian Express recently pointed out that NPAs have now fallen below 6%. Right. They're at 5.84, 5.9%.
Yeah, and the net NPA is actually around 1%. So that's very good indeed, actually. Now, of course, there's still some NPAs that we don't know yet as a consequence of COVID. That'll come out a little later, but it won't be very...
Is there a third factor?
No, so I was just saying that so the bank balance sheet and credit growth is going up. Third, capacity, we had a great amount of excess capacity in the system. A lot of that has been exhausted.
Whereabouts is now capacity utilization?
It's around 70% now, according to the RBI's numbers. So there are signs that capacity. So the point is that there's a greater likelihood. Okay.
That 23-24 will be better than 22-23.
Yes, it's possible. And again, I said, given all the uncertainty.
Well, hang on a second. There's a difference between greater likelihood and possible. Possible suggests it could happen. Greater likelihood is more confident. Which of the two do you mean?
Possible.
Not greater likelihood.
Because of the high uncertainty.
Possible.
Possible because of the high uncertainty.
Let me just once again put this in simple layman's language.
Yes.
You're saying it's possible that 23-24 will show a higher level of GDP growth than 22-23. Is that right?
It's possible, yes.
It's possible.
But with this huge uncertainty, everything that you stated very well.
Well, this is very interesting. Let me then sum up what we've said. Your expectation, and maybe I should actually say hope, for this present year, 22-23, is somewhere between 6.5 and 7. But if we miss the quarter 2 expectation, which will come out in a couple of days' time, of 6.1 to 6.3, then it's quite possible it could fall below 6.5. Equally, it's possible that 23-24 could be better than 22-23, but only possible. Both your figures for 22-23 and 23-24 are possible figures, not really likelihood figures. That's because of the uncertainty.
Possible, and because of great uncertainty, I can't be more precise than that.
Let's then, at this point, talk about growth in a slightly different way.
Let me just say let me say one more thing, actually. That the thing that among the global developments, the greatest difficulty that will come for the world and for us is really to do with exports.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a moment, Sam. Let's talk about growth in a slightly different way. If you compare the quarter 1 figure of this year, 13.5%, with quarter 1 for the last pre-pandemic year, which is 2019-2020, the economy has grown by 3.8%, which on an annualized basis is the growth of 1.3% a year. Does that suggest to you that we have a growth problem?
No, the way I would put it is that because of COVID, we've lost 2 years. A good part of the world has lost 2 years, and so have we. And therefore, it's even more important that to make up, we put much more effort in terms of future growth. But yes, of course, that's a problem. We've lost 2 years. 2 years, losing 2 years of growth is a lot. And it is true, of course, that prior to COVID, growth had been slowing down.
Which is why I ask you, because this is, in fact, the declining growth trend. 2016-17, we were at 8.3%. 2017-18, at 6.9%. 2018-19, 6.6, 2019-20, 4.8, 2020-21, minus 6.6.
That's all COVID.
This is why I asked.
You have to exclude the 2021 because of COVID. But it was clearly slowing down before
that. Which is why I asked, do we have a deeper-seated growth problem?
I wouldn't say a deeper-seated growth problem, but what I would say is that among the problems, apart from exports, which we'll come back to later, a deeper-seated problem that does exist is the decline of investment and savings. Of course, the two are connected, that if savings decline in the system, you can't invest. Let me finish. So it is the case that savings have fallen, particularly household financial savings, over the last 10 years. And one of the things that we found is that the growth of household consumption kept up to around 7.2%, say 2012.
So savings is going into consumption?
So saving, that is, people's income is going more into consumption. And if income growth is lower than consumption growth, obviously savings will fall. Previous 40 years or 50 years, that has never been the case. That households' disposable income growth was higher than the consumption growth, and therefore savings kept increasing.
Let me point out to the audience the extent to which savings have declined. I'm talking now about the investment rate. It had hit a high of 39.1 in 2007-2008. It's declined to 32.2 by 2019-20.
That's absolutely right.
What's your explanation for this fairly steady, sharp decline?
Well, on a lighter note, I left the Reserve Bank in 2008-9, so savings have been declining ever since. But that's much more on a lighter note.
Your absence has done it. But on a more serious note, what's the explanation?
On a serious note, just what I said, the explanation is that people had got used to consumption growth going up, and they continued with that. Part of that are two things actually. One, that the availability of credit for buying consumer durables, for housing, mortgages, etc., for our country has been a new thing since the early 2000s.
Quite right.
And
People have been increasing their credit and not, and borrowing has gone up, savings has gone down.
Right.
But tell me something.
People have been borrowing.
Can I interrupt you?
No, let me just finish. People have been continuing to borrow to consume. The second thing that I would say, of which I don't have the numbers, is that the expenditures on education and health have been increasing tremendously because of continued privatization and increase in the costs.
Let me put this to you. Investment is critical because that is necessary for the country to grow.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, consumption is important because it's demand.
Absolutely.
And demand actually encourages investment. Now, if consumer spending is going up, but in the investment rate is going down, why is that a problem for the economy? Can you explain that to the audience in simple language?
Well, I'm not very good at simple language, but I'll try. For the economy to grow, you have to build capacity in terms of production of all kinds, whether it's cars or hotels or housing or whatever it is. That if that comes down, the future growth comes down because you're just not producing enough.
And that is what happens when the investment rate declines.
That's right.
We're not building the infrastructure, we're not building the factories, we're not building.
The infrastructure investment has improved in the last few years, and there's clearly a lot of emphasis in infrastructure, and we can see.
But we're not building the factories that produce jobs.
We're not building the factories that produce jobs, and that's what is important.
Now, let me tell you an explanation given by Kaushik Basu, the former chief economic advisor, in an article that he wrote for The Hindu just about a week or 10 days ago. He said, and I'm quoting him, that the problem afflicting India's investment rate is a problem of trust. His precise words were the following: as the level of trust erodes in a society, investment tends to fall. Given the rise of political polarization and the policy of divide and rule, it's likely that societal trust is eroding, and this is reducing the investment rate. In other words, the polarization, the anti-Muslim attitude that is often adopted by the ruling party and its MPs, and the othering of minorities is changing the atmosphere. And I suppose he would also include the attitude and intolerance of dissent and a whole lot of other concerns about the functioning of institutions. Do you agree that it is trust that is the problem?
I have no way of measuring that, and as an economist, of course, Kaushik is a very distinguished economist, but I really have no comment on that because I don't have a way of measuring the trust.
In other words, it could be a problem, but we don't know.
No, I wouldn't even, I don't know, quite frankly. So what I am saying, however, as I said before, that because of the huge damage to balance sheets, because of very large NPAs, etc., that credit had come down, investment had come down. Now these things have been cleaned up. Therefore, there's a greater possibility, and of course, as I said, there was excess capacity which has been caught up. There's a greater likelihood, of things going up in the coming years.
You've sidestepped commenting on Kaushik Basu's explanation for the declining investment rate, and I understand why, but you're hopeful that because NPAs have come down fairly sharply to under 6%, because company balance sheets have cleaned up, and because excess capacity is now diminished, it's up to 70-75% utilization. For all three reasons, you're hopeful that the investment rate over the next 4 or 5 years will pick up, which means growth will also pick up over the next 4 or 5 years. Yes. But you're saying that the turnaround in the investment rate and in growth will take 4 or 5 years. It's not going to happen overnight.
Nothing happens overnight. And as I said, again, I will repeat what I said in the beginning, which is that the uncertainty in the world is such that you have to have very diffuse expectations as of now.
Even therefore, the hope that the investment rate and therefore growth will pick up over the next 4 or 5 years is tempered by the uncertainty that there is today and the fact that we don't know how long that uncertainty will last.
Yeah, absolutely. And
let me then at this point...
The one thing I would also say is that one of the interesting things that is happening currently is that emerging markets in general are doing better than advanced economies.
And that gives us hope.
That gives us hope because the weight of the emerging markets is now continuing to increase, particularly the countries to the east of us.
Okay, let me now look at another aspect of the economy, and that is to do with MSMEs. We know, for instance, that hotels, transport, trade, which represent 30.5% of employment, are 15.5% below pre-pandemic levels. We know that the construction sector, which is the second biggest employer, is just about 1% above pre-pandemic levels. But what about MSMEs? They represent 30% of the economy, 45% or thereabouts of employment. What is the situation they face? What sort of problems are they in?
So let me first say that the sectors that you mentioned, trade, transport, hotels, etc., that they're obviously, now that hopefully COVID is almost done, to the extent the government has now also removed the air suvidha requirements.
We'll know the answer when quarter two results come out.
Yeah, no, apart from that, that going into the future, looking at the kind of increase in the travel rates now, whether it is trains, whether it's planes, etc., that as COVID goes, obviously those things will improve. How fast they'll improve, of course, one doesn't know. Second, on construction, one thing very interesting is that housing prices, contrary to many people's understanding, have been almost stable for 10 years, and they had rocketed up in the previous 10 years. And there also the inventory of housing has now come down. There was large inventory.
So again, prices should go up.
Well, about prices, more construction will now take place.
Okay, both of that I understand.
So those things.
Let's not get lost on that. Come back to MSMEs.
No, since you mentioned that, I wanted to just say this.
Okay, but come to MSMEs.
Three on SMSEs, we just don't have adequate information as of now.
When you say we don't have adequate information, do we simply not know what sort of situation they face?
I certainly don't know what situation they face.
So
anecdotal information suggests that as a consequence of COVID, they've suffered much more.
This is therefore a black hole in our economy. We just don't know enough.
We just don't know enough about what's actually happened there. Anecdotal information, as I said, suggests that they were damaged much more.
Is it anecdotal information suggests that they've been damaged very substantially?
Yes.
Much more than the rest of the economy.
Much more than the formal sector.
Much more than the formal sector. Yeah. So is it worrying that MSMEs, which constitute 30% of the economy, 45% of employment, and if you add to that the unorganized sector, then the total level of employment goes up pretty close to 91%. Is it worrying that we don't know more, that it's a virtual black hole?
Yes, we do need to get more information. Again, what one's hope would be that if the formal sector does recover in the way that I've been describing, that they will bring up the informal sector, the MSMEs, etc., but we just don't know enough.
So it remains a black hole?
But we just don't know enough.
So it remains a black hole?
Yeah, well, those are your words, not mine.
Absolutely, but you agree with them?
But I agree that we don't have enough information.
Pranab Sen, the former chief statistician, told us in an interview a few weeks ago that he firmly believes that the MSME sector has shrunk considerably in the last 2 years. And then he added something. He said what makes it more worrying for him is that we don't have effective means of reaching out and helping them because the informal lines of credit that they depend upon seem to have dried up. To what extent do you agree with that understanding and analysis?
Well, first, I'm not sure what his information is, but he could be right because he's a very sensible, thoughtful observer. And those things are correct in the sense it seems that they have suffered much more. You don't quite know how to get to them. However, the one thing good that the government did do as a consequence of COVID is to give those guarantees of credit lines for SMSEs to banks, and they have been used.
And what Pranab Sen says about those credit lines is that they may have kept existing MSEs afloat, but we haven't had new startups. And secondly, we don't know how many of the existing MSEs actually didn't stay afloat and have collapsed.
As I said, we don't know. We don't know that. I mean, I'm not sure how he can say that new MSMEs hadn't come up. He could well be right because I have no information either way on that.
But we don't know for sure. Now, many people looking at the situation that India has believe that in fact our recovery from COVID as well as the growth that we've seen thereafter is K-shaped. And what is happening to car sales in a sense seems to corroborate that. Two-wheelers and entry-level cars are struggling, they're facing headwinds. High-end cars, and particularly those that cost more than 10 lakhs, are growing at a fair clip. So would you accept that our recovery and our growth is K-shaped?
Yes, it certainly looks like that, given exactly what you've said on the car sales, etc., that the high-end stuff is moving much faster. And if you just on casual observation, you can sort of see the proliferation of high-end cars that one sees if you just walk around some of the richer neighborhoods of Delhi. As I walk around my neighborhood, I can certainly see that, but that's just casual observation.
So your casual observation is that this is a K-shaped recovery?
This looks like a K-shaped recovery, and we'll have to work very hard to repair that.
Let me pick up on that point. We have to work very hard to repair that. I'm going right back on purpose to our discussion about MSMEs. If we don't know the situation that they confront, anecdotally we believe that they have suffered far more, I think was your word, than the formal sector, but we don't have data. Could it be that the K-shape is actually a much wider K than we realize? That one arm is going sharply up because formal sector industries are actually showing fairly healthy profits, but we don't know about the MSMEs and we don't know what happened there. Therefore, the bottom end of the K may be sharply going down.
Well, no, if the formal sector does recover in the way that I've been describing, in terms of all the metrics that we have, in terms of the improved health of the corporate sector, the banks, etc., then they'll also pull up the SMSEs, because there's a whole supply chain that comes. That if they produce more, there's more and more
This is
sourcing.
a supposition.
Well, no, it's not just a supposition. That's exactly how the economy operates.
Well, the problem is that we only understand the MSME sector and the unorganized sector in particular by doing some sort of proxy from the formal sector.
Well, no, I'm
right? But if there's a disjunct between the two and they're not growing at the same level, then the basis on which we calculate how the MSMEs and the unorganized sector is doing may not be accurate any longer. So if the MSMEs are doing far worse than the formal sector, we may not have a clear idea.
That's not quite right. We do know from the past and how the GDP, etc., is calculated. There are sample surveys and so on of MSMEs, there's the economic census, etc. So we do know from the past that there is a good connection between the growth of the unorganized sector. Let me finish.
We're saying the same thing. We're saying the same thing. There is a connection, but the point I'm picking up is the one you made, that if the MSMEs have done far worse than the formal sector, that connection may have weakened.
No, because of COVID. Now,
absolutely.
Yeah, as we
absolutely.
Yeah,
but if that connection has weakened,
as we recover from COVID, that connection should come back.
Well, that will happen in due course. But at the moment, but at the moment, because the connection has broken and MSMEs have done far worse, we actually may find that the bottom arm of the K is more steeply downwards and the upper arm may be more steeply upwards. In other words, it may be a wider K.
I would say that because of COVID, it won't say broken, it has weakened. It's not broken, it's weakened. But
isn't that a terminological difference and nothing more?
There's a difference between weakened and broken. It's like having a fracture as opposed to a crack. There's a difference in that. A fracture is much worse than having a crack when you fall down or something. So there is a difference between broken and weakened.
Many people will suspect you're using language to comfort yourself.
No, I'm sorry.
It's your prerogative.
No.
That's your prerogative.
That's not many people. I would say, not to comfort myself, but just again, you recover much faster from a crack than what you do from a fracture.
Maybe. So, but the point I'm saying is not the recovery. I'm not talking about the speed of the recovery. I'm talking about the situation today. And the situation today may be that MSMEs, which is the bottom arm of the K, are more steeply downwards than we realize because we just don't know.
As I said, we don't know. So, as I said,
it could be.
No, as I said, that they have obviously suffered more. There's no question about that.
Let's at this point come to another issue of concern that I want to raise with you. And in a sense, it's a discussion that flows out of the one we're having about MSMEs and the K-shaped recovery of the economy. And that's unemployment. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that unemployment in October was 7.8%. The Business Standard on Tuesday said that for the last week, it was actually 8.41%. Also, demand for NREGA during the first few months of this financial year was significantly more than the corresponding period of the pre-pandemic financial year. Does that suggest to you that unemployment and joblessness are not just a continuing problem, but possibly a worsening problem?
Well, the employment issue actually has dogged us for not just the last 2 years, but the last 2 decades, if not more. the employment generation that we've had in the organized sector has just not been adequate given our growth rates. As we economists say, the elasticity of employment with respect to production is very low. That is, if you have a 10% increase in production, then the employment increase may be
How
2%.
bad is the unemployment situation facing India?
Yeah. So, one of the things I think that the numbers that he quoted, I have very little faith in, because poor people in India can't remain unemployed because then they can't eat. So there's a lot of underemployment. There hasn't,
And poor quality
and
employment.
Poor quality of employment. And there hasn't, the movement out of agriculture has just not been enough.
But answer this question for me. How bad is the unemployment or employment situation facing the economy?
Well, I think it's that's the most serious issue that has been, that is of concern.
It's the most serious concern.
The most serious concern is to do with employment. You can see that in the kind of numbers of people who apply for even very simple jobs, low-level jobs, whenever they're advertised. It's like a factor of 30 or something like that. That if you advertise 1,000 jobs or 30,000 people,
This is hunger for jobs.
this is hunger for jobs. This is just people are not getting jobs.
Is this
And this
another
is-
factor that is slowing the growth of our economy? Because if people don't have jobs, they can't spend. If they can't spend, they can't create
that's
demand.
clearly-
If there's no demand, there's no investment. If
that's-
there's no investment, there's no growth.
that's
So
clear-
is
that's-
unemployment
that's clearly-
a core problem that's holding back our rate of growth?
Well, that I'm not so sure, because obviously, as I said, that the rate of growth of employment has been much slower than the rate of growth of output, and therefore you could be growing and increasing inequality.
We're
and
having,
increasing
therefore,
consumption.
jobless growth.
So you're having almost jobless growth in the past many years. Not just recent. It's like, as I said, it's a long term.
That is the problem. We're growing as an economy, but we're not creating jobs.
Yes, and that's a big issue there. I want to come back to exports.
Can I just point out something, that if jobless growth is a problem that India faces and has faced for many years, many decades, as you're suggesting, then is it the case that the country or the economy is growing richer, but people as a whole are not getting richer? They don't have jobs.
Well, the employment generation has clearly not been adequate. However, people on at almost all segments of people have been getting better off in the last 30 years. That there's no question. That they should have been getting better faster.
And this, as you said, is the biggest, most serious concern in your eyes.
Am
I right? The biggest, most serious concern in your eyes?
The biggest issue from the country is indeed generating employment, and good employment, quality employment. And for that, much more emphasis has to be given to labor-intensive, large industry employment.
Why isn't industry concentrating on labor-intensive manufacturing, labor-intensive factories? Why is that not happening? Why is private investment going in for machine-led growth rather than employment-led growth?
This is something I've never understood well, because when we did the reforms in the early 1990s, our expectation was that as we increased competition, as we opened the economy, and the banks, etc., improved, that given the low level of wages in the country, that the private sector would invest.
But it hasn't.
But it is not.
Do you feel let down?
I absolutely feel let down on that.
Has the private sector made a terrible mistake?
Well, I don't know about terrible mistake, because I presume they know where their money comes from. So I really, as I said, I really don't understand. It's a real puzzle to me.
But because if they don't create jobs, then they won't have people with money to buy what they're making.
Because all the East Asian countries that have exhibited high growth and success in development and income growth, they concentrated on labor-intensive employment, whether it's Korea, whether it is Japan 50 years ago, whether it's China in the last 30 years, and Vietnam.
India is the outlier.
India is the outlier on this issue. And now
then this raises the question. The government is trying to boost. Let me try. The government is trying to boost manufacturing through the production link incentive scheme, but that is actually concentrating on companies that are using machines and other utilities rather than creating jobs. Is that the wrong approach?
Yeah, I wish that they would do much more PLI in labor-intensive sectors.
So it is the wrong approach.
I wish they would much more important to the labor-intensive sectors. One of the ways that I put this is that as I spent the last 2010 to 2020, a good part of my life in the United States for almost 10 years, I used to go on tourist trips to places like Walmart. And I didn't need to buy anything, but I used to always turn them over and look, where is it made? And one found China, one found Vietnam, sometimes Ethiopia, sometimes
Increasingly
Mexico.
Bangladesh.
And Bangladesh, of course, particularly on garments.
But not India as much.
Except for towels.
But not India as much.
Not India as much, except for towels.
And this is an opportunity our private sector is losing out on.
Yeah, it's an absolute opportunity because this is a very important point, Karan. This is a big opportunity as China's wages have been going up. Lot of stuff is moving out from China.
But it's not moving to India always.
Not coming to India.
It's going to Bangladesh, it's going to Vietnam.
We need to incentivize large companies.
Okay,
let me just finish. This is a very important point. Most people don't realize that success in exports comes from large companies doing exports. Our own understanding has been small and medium enterprises.
Well, that's where our employment laws come in the way.
Yeah, and well,
the Industrial Relations Act to begin with.
Possibly, and that of course has been improved. Yeah, but let me finish on that. See, on the Industrial Relations Act, after all...
let's not get lost in the Industrial Relations Act.
No, I'm not getting lost in that.
Because we keep getting deflected on sidetracks.
No, I'm not getting lost in that. I'm making a very significant point that we would increase employment by encouraging large companies to invest in export labor-intensive activities. Our self-perception has been that it is small and medium companies that do exports. But actually, it's larger companies that have all been much more successful because the productivity levels are much higher.
But then the system, but what you're saying is that the system, not just the Industrial Relations Act, which comes as a hurdle in terms of employing more people above 300, but the system and attitude of government needs to change. And therefore,
it's not just government, it's the private sector also. So I wouldn't blame the government.
And private sector, but the laws are made by the government. So to the extent to which you need laws like the Industrial Relations Act to be changed, amended or altered, that's government. But you also need the private sector to concentrate on employment generating businesses and companies rather than machine-led ones. And you also need a change away from the production-led incentive scheme towards an employment-led incentive scheme.
Well, I wouldn't say employment-led incentive scheme, production-linked incentive, but more towards labor-intensive sectors, and that the industry itself should realize that, look, this is a great thing to do.
Let me raise another aspect of the unemployment jobless problem with you. Again, writing in the Hindu 2-3 weeks ago, Kaushik Basu, the former chief economic advisor, this time relying upon ILO figures, says that India has a particularly bad youth unemployment problem. He's talking about people between the ages of 15 and 24. Youth unemployment, he says, is 28.3%, which means our youth are far more unemployed than Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia. Our levels of youth unemployment are on par with countries like Iran and Syria. Now, we're talking about an age group that is the future of the country. If they're unemployed at this age, they become dispirited, they may even stop looking for work. How much of a concern is this?
Obviously, it's a big concern, but I would add another concern to that, which is that the biggest error or biggest mistake that we have made in the last 75 years is the lack of attention to health and education and nutrition for the whole period since independence. So even our National Family Health Survey shows that more than 30% of our children are stunted, more than 20% of our children are wasted. So that just suggests that even today, children entering the workforce, children just growing up, but when they enter the workforce for the next 25 years, you have a large proportion who will be handicapped in terms of ability to learn, ability to work, etc. So it's to my mind, it's an emergency situation that we have to put much more attention to health, education, and nutrition.
And to pick up on your point about
adds to this whole issue.
And to pick up on your point about health and education, this is a problem that goes back to 47 and it continues right through the present government as well. We keep talking about increasing health expenditure to 3%. It's just about above 1 to 1.5.
That hasn't happened.
We keep talking about pushing up expenditure on education to 6%. It's teetering around 3.5%, 4%. Progressive governments, successive governments have let us down.
Absolutely.
And what you're saying is that what compounds the youth unemployment problem is the fact that they're unhealthy, uneducated,
Exactly,
and therefore not able to work.
Exactly, and they are not unable to do skilled jobs because that requires greater training.
They're
greater
just not
education,
trained for it.
Just not trained for it. So this is now one corollary to this, which is very important, is that if you need to increase the expenditure as we must, what does it imply? It implies that your tax GDP ratio has to go up. You have to collect much more taxes, and the tax GDP ratio has been rock solid for the last 15 years
But
or
let's
so.
not get on tax.
No, 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 no,
because
sir. No, 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 no,
Dr.
no, no,
Mohan, we
no.
must
This,
stick to
no,
one subject.
No, 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 sir. This is very important. That if
Everything's important.
No, no, no. To increase expenditures in health and education, you've got to get more revenue.
But let's focus on the problem of unemployment. And one of the derivatives of that is the labor force participation rate in India, anyway very low at 42, 43%, has now fallen to 39%.
Yes, absolutely.
Which means that young people, but even elderly people, have actually given up looking for jobs.
Yes,
they have become dispirited and they've opted out of the market.
actually-
That's another problem. Side by side with unemployment is also people giving up looking for jobs.
Actually, what is worse is that the labor force participation rate of women is among the lowest in the world. Okay.
And way lower than Bangladesh again.
Well, it's at a similar levels to Middle Eastern countries. Okay. And
Yeah, but what I'm saying is lower than Bangladesh, our next door neighbor.
no, Bangladesh for women is quite high, which again goes back to labor intensive manufacturing. That so much of the labor intensive, so much of the Bangladesh success in exports and manufacturing is because lots of women, I've been there and seen this in their factories actually. Just lots of women working in these factories. So that's another issue, I think, that now the positive side of this is, in the last 20 years, the number of girls going into college, etc., has increased. So now in colleges, the male-female ratio is about equal. I mean, male-female ratio is 50-50 now. So there's increasing number of women who are actually educated but are not working.
And that's not the situation here. Women's participation in our
very
labor
low.
force is very low.
Exactly.
CMIE,
Yes.
I know you don't have full faith in CMIE as you've indicated, but CMIE says it could be as low as something like 10 to 15% in India. The government's figures are around 20. CMIE says it's between 10 and 15. That's worryingly low. Because 50% of the potential workforce is not working.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's come then at this point.
So this is an extremely important point.
Absolutely. And I want to emphasize that the two things that we've established, or three rather so far, is one, we don't have a clear idea what will be growth this year or next year because of the uncertainties in the situation. We cannot say with precision or conviction what it will be. We can only say what's possible, not even necessarily likely. Secondly, we don't know very much about the situation facing MSMEs, which are 30% of our economy, 45% of our employment. In a sense, to use my phrase, it's a sort of black hole where we need to know a lot more. But the biggest problem we face is the problem of employment. I'm using unemployment as a short form, but it's underemployment, it's not proper employment, right? And that means people don't have money to spend, they don't create demand, there's no cause for investment, there isn't growth. And the worst part is that people are opting out of looking for jobs because our labor force participation is falling. This leads naturally.
And I'll just add to that the low labor force participation of women. That's a big issue. And incidentally, that also no, that's very important. That the more women that work, will also lead to greater social improvement of the status of women.
Absolutely. But all of this leads to my next issue of concern: poverty. A recent study by the World Bank established that 80% of people who slipped into poverty in 2020 as a result of COVID were Indians. And the figure in absolute terms that the World Bank quoted was 56 million. Few surveys in India have suggested it could be 75 million. At least one study by the Azim Premji Foundation put it even above 200 million. Is poverty a problem that hasn't got the attention it deserves?
Well, I'll say it somewhat differently. Once again, we've had no national household survey to measure the poverty since 2011-12. There was one in 2017-18, but it had some technical problems, so that has not been released. So we don't really have a way of really knowing what is the poverty level. However, to the extent that the poverty level was around 20% in 2011-12, given the growth that has taken place, it would certainly have improved. But I would say that there would be reasonable consensus that, again, taking out the COVID problems, that poverty would be around 10% plus minus whatever. So look, even
what would the plus minus factor be?
No, just measurement. I mean, we don't know. We just don't know. So what I'm saying is that even with 10%, there's 140 million people.
Which is huge.
Which is huge. So that, suppose it's more than that, it could be between 140 and 200. We just don't know. But it's clearly at least 140 million, at 10%.
So is that another concern for a democracy?
That's a huge problem. And that is something that we can repair.
Now, side by
again,
side.
to do with employment again.
Absolutely. Once you give these people jobs, they will get out of poverty themselves.
Yes.
But if you aren't creating jobs, they continue to languish in poverty.
Yes, then you have. That's why you have Manrega. That's why you have to have food distribution.
But Manrega is not.
These are all alleviation.
Absolutely, it's not a cure.
It's not a cure. These are alleviation. And that's an index actually. That you have to have Manrega, you have to have food distribution programs, etc., as alleviation welfare programs, because not enough jobs are being created.
Which is why it is worrying that demand for NREGA during the first few months of this financial year has been significantly more than it was for the last pre-pandemic year. It clearly shows that the number of people dependent upon NREGA for a living has gone up. That means they've slipped into poverty.
Yeah, and again the issue comes back to the general point of not enough non-agriculture jobs being generated, so people are stuck there. And obviously, to the extent that agriculture production now is about 15% or less of the GDP, whereas employment in agriculture is around 40%.
And
so that's again a key core issue.
This ties up with the point you made that private sector companies need to go in for employment generating businesses rather than machine-led businesses.
Thank you, Karan, for expressing what I said much better.
Let me put it like this. Yeah. Another concern, because I'm going through all of them with you, is inflation. For 10 months, it's been substantially above the outer limit of 6%. And the question is this: should the Reserve Bank continue to raise interest rates to tackle inflation, or given the problems and uncertainty about growth, do we need a different approach to tackling inflation?
Well, let me make 2 or 3 points on this. One, our inflation has been sort of around 6% plus minus 1 for 4 years or so. Okay. 2, today's inflation is much lower than inflation in the advanced economies, which is 10% plus. The US has come down a bit, around 8%, but this is about the first time actually for a long, long period of time that our inflation, actually other emerging markets as well, is lower than advanced economies. So our inflation is not half as bad in a sense as what's happened in advanced economies. 3, coming to the Reserve Bank's monetary policy, that I've never been a votary of the inflation targeting framework because it has all kinds of assumptions which I won't go to here. That inflation management is a much larger issue which has to be tackled. The Reserve Bank, of course, also the central bank has to be concerned with inflation, and so it has to deal with that.
So what should it do?
So I'm just coming to that. So in terms of the policy rate, given that inflation is 6% plus, 6.71, 6.71, that the policy rate is still lower than the inflation rate. In other words, you have a negative real policy rate. That is, your policy rate is still lower than inflation. So
you're talking about the interest rate.
The interest rate, that's right. So for depositors like you and me are not even getting returns equal to the inflation.
So therefore you're in favor of raising the interest rate.
Raising the interest rate.
So you believe that the way to tackle the inflation that we have, and forgive me, it's not 6.71, it's 6.77%, the way to tackle that and bring it down under 6% is to keep steadily raising the interest rate.
I didn't quite say that, Karan, because I think that it's not a sort of one-to, I've always felt that inflation targeting makes monetary policy and macro policy into a Mickey Mouse system. That is, you take interest rate up, inflation will come down, and the opposite. There are many other things to be done, but of course interest rate is important, and given that it's still negative, it should be taken up.
Okay.
And one thing.
Let me just paraphrase for the audience what you're saying. The reason you believe we can continue to tackle inflation by raising the interest rate is because the real interest rate is still lower.
Exactly.
And therefore, we need to push the real interest
Yes.
rate above
Yes.
inflation
Yes.
levels, which is why tackling inflation by pushing up the interest
Yes.
rate is acceptable to you.
Yes, and in the world also, actually, the advanced economies, their interest rates are much lower than inflation rates.
Okay.
So their interest rates will go up, have to go up further.
Which is another reason for
Which is
us to
another
go up.
reason for uncertainty.
Otherwise,
of
money
what's
will
happening.
flood out of our
Exactly.
country.
And so, for example, Larry Summers has said for their economies that he has said that for the interest rate to have a proper impact on inflation, the unemployment will have to go up to 7.5%, and that will be very difficult politically.
So, just to be absolutely clear for the audience, you believe that there would be sense and logic behind tackling the inflation problem we have by pushing up interest rates, particularly because the real interest rate is below inflation and therefore it needs to be pushed up, and therefore tackling inflation by pushing up interest rates at this point of time makes sense.
Yes, and at the same time, of course, doing whatever you can to increase supply of food products as well as other products. On the supply, this is just the demand side. You have to operate on the supply side as well. That's the government's job.
The final issue I want to raise with you is the rupee. At the moment, it's trading somewhere between 81 and 82 to the dollar. But you know better than I do that whilst there is pressure on the current account deficit, there will continue to be pressure on the rupee. In those circumstances, should the RBI allow the rupee to gently decline in a controlled way, hoping therefore that exports will build up and hoping that will accelerate growth? Or are you worried that the decline in the rupee will increase the price and cost of imports, which in turn will add to inflation? Because as Michael Patra, the RBI Deputy Governor, points out, over 30% of the consumer price index is imports. And if inflation goes up, consumer spending will come down. And if consumer spending comes down, demand comes down, investment comes down, then that has an implication for growth. So in a very real sense, in terms of handling the rupee, the RBI faces a sort of Hobson's choice. Neither of the two solutions are easy ones. What would be your advice to them?
I'm very clear on saying yes to your first.
Let the rupee slide.
Let the rupee slide, of course, in a managed manner. Managed in the sense that, look, what you don't want is for the markets to lose confidence, so it clearly should not crash. But we have been overvalued for a long period of time, according to the real exchange rate measures. That's among the things that has discouraged labor-intensive manufacturing, because in labor-intensive manufacturing, price is very important for the global markets. And second, that again on the exchange rate, as you're saying, that we have depreciated less than most other emerging market countries, that is China, Indonesia, etc. So that for us to be competitive,
we need to depreciate
we need to depreciate more.
Now, what about the impact on inflation because imports go up?
Well, I think, you see, what happens here is that if the rupee doesn't depreciate enough, we become less competitive. What does that mean? That means that there's much more pressure on domestic producers in competition to imports. So actually your production will go down if it doesn't depreciate adequately, the real exchange rate, relative to other countries. So therefore, that for the industry to continue to grow, as we were talking about earlier, and for industries to invest more, to have more capital investment, that this indication is very, very important.
A sliding rupee provides a measure of protection to domestic industry, perhaps encourages them to make what is previously being imported, now they can make it here.
So it's both good for exports and for domestic production. People usually don't realize the impact of domestic production.
Okay. We're coming right to the end of this interview. Given everything that we've been discussing for the last 40-45 minutes, are you concerned by the state of the economy today? Or do you believe that the problems we've touched upon, be they growth, be they MSMEs, be they investment, be they employment, be it poverty or inflation, are these problems transitory and can they be easily resolved? So which is the answer? Are you concerned about the state of the economy, or do you think these are transitory problems that can be relatively easily resolved?
First, I'm concerned about the global economy, and in the sense that it affects us, that we are, as I said right in the beginning, we are in very uncertain times. advanced economy interest rates will continue going up for quite some time.
What about the Indian economy?
No, I'm coming to that. It's because that's connected. And so unless the global economy grows, we have an issue, particularly in global trade. That what has already happened is.
But we're running out of time. You explained at great length in the first part of this interview how the international uncertainty impacts on us. So let's not repeat that.
No, I'm saying something different. That the ratio of global trade to global GDP has been coming down consistently since 2010. And the IMF's projection for 2030, so that talking about 8 years from now, is going further down. Therefore, these are all negative things.
Come now to the Indian economy, please.
No, that's what I'm saying. That therefore, this is very important for us.
Yeah,
therefore, we have to make much greater effort to be. So that's a great concern for me for the Indian economy.
But let me rephrase. Let me rephrase my question. Are you concerned about the state of the economy today, or do you believe the problems we've touched upon are transitory and can be easily resolved?
No, nothing is easy to resolve in an economy. That's why I was saying that we have to be much more concerned about keeping our heads up above water, given what's happening in the world, and the problems that we have touched upon all are and have been exacerbated by the COVID. So, of course, it's of concern that to come out of all this, we have to be concerned about this, we have to be bothered about it, and we haven't talked anything about the fiscal situation, which I won't now, there's no time, but I think all these things are connected.
So you are concerned.
I'm concerned, of course I'm concerned.
Let me ask you this. You have watched and studied the Indian economy for several decades. Compared to problems we faced in the past, how serious is the problem we face today?
Well, it's not as serious as the problem was in 1991. Okay, so that's very clear. But it is a very difficult situation, especially because the trend of growth has been muted in the last 10 years, last 10, 12 years, since 2010 or thereabouts. So this is something that it is of great concern.
So we face, I'm using your words, we face a very difficult situation.
Yes.
It is a situation of great concern.
Yes.
Dr. Mohan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.